And according to your website, you're also, I'm going to quote here, a longtime Democratic Party activist who served as a member of the 2016 Democratic National Convention's Platform Standing Committee, close quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You support Hamas, do you not?
Senator, oddly enough, I'm going to say thank you for that question because it demonstrates the purpose of our hearing today in a very effective way.
Let's start first with a yes or no.
Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization that I do not support, but you asking the executive director of the Arab American Institute that question very much puts the focus on the issue of hate in our country.
Well, I got your answer, and I appreciate it. What is the, you support Hezbollah too, don't you?
Again, I find this line of questioning extraordinarily disappointing,
Is that a
Senator.
no?
That
Or
you
a
have
yes?
you have Arab American constituents that you represent
is
in
that
your great state.
Yes, ma'am, I understand that, but my time's limited, and I apologize, but is that a yes or a no?
A yes or no question to do I support Hezbollah? The answer is I don't support violence, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, or any other entity that invokes it.
You can't
So
bring
no,
yourself to say no, can you?
No, I can say no. I can say yes.
But
What
you
I can
haven't.
say is
You just
your
can't
line
make
of
yourself do
questioning.
it. Do you
Senator.
support or oppose Iran and their hatred of Jews?
Again, I'm going to emphasize Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, none of them is going to, this
You can't bring
discussion.
yourself to say no, can
Sir,
you?
I don't support.
It's real simple.
Excuse me, I'm going to,
Ian,
if I may, as a Muslim woman, sir, I'm going to tell you I do not support Iran. But what I will tell you is that this conversation.
I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. You called our decision to cut funding. You called our decision to cut fund. Well, first, what's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency?
It's UNRWA, which is the institution that exists to provide services and aid to the nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees.
And you called our decision to cut funding for them, quote, an incredible moral failure, close quote.
That is absolutely correct. But again, I would suggest that conversation is about foreign policy.
We did that because 9 UNRWA staff members were fired for actually helping Hamas on October 7th. Isn't that the case?
I don't believe that that's correct in terms
Let
of.
me ask you one more time. You support Hamas, don't you? You support UNRWA and Hamas, don't you?
Sir,
Please.
I think it's exceptionally disappointing that you're looking at an Arab American witness before you and saying you support Hamas.
You know what's disappointing to me?
I do not support Hamas.
Bring yourself
I do
to
not
say
support Hamas
you don't
or
support UNRWA. You don't support Hamas. You don't.
I was very clear in my support for UNRWA.
Hezbollah, and you don't support Iran. You should hide your head in a bag.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. My name is Sadi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Usama and Kareem. And today we have with us a special guest, Maya Berry, who features in the video you just saw at the beginning of this video. Maya serves as the executive director of the Arab American Institute in Washington, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national civil rights advocacy organization that aims to empower Arab American communities across the U.S. Maya has also contributed to the first government relations department at AAI and worked for one stint away from the AAI as the legislative director for House Minority Whip David Bonnier, I think in Michigan, if I remember correctly, where she managed the legislative strategy and developed policies on international relations, human rights, immigration, and civil rights. Returning to AAI, she's helped to expand the organization's work on combating hate crime, protecting the civil rights of Arab Americans and other racialized communities, and advocating for the creation of a MENA category, that is Middle Eastern and North African category, in, for example, the U.S. Census, which we'll talk about a little bit later on today. For those of you who don't know, Arab Americans are technically, or have been until recently, counted as white rather than members of a specific community like Middle Eastern and North African. So Maya, welcome to our podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for asking me to join you. As I said, I'm a huge fan, so it's an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you. So Maya, we'd actually like to begin at the end and with that incredible congressional hearing and its culmination with a senator from, I believe, Louisiana telling you to put a bag over your head. Um, but we'll come back to that. But like, let's work back from that and ask you how you got to sitting in that seat in that congressional hearing room. Like, what is the path you took to become the person who's the executive director of AAI?
So I've been deeply entrenched in political work my entire life. And there's a joke my family would tell. I was born in Lebanon, actually. And they would tell this joke about I would come home from school and I would steal my younger sister's bottle and the newspaper. People have often asked this idea of like, when do you become political? I think there are those of us who, frankly, have never had the privilege of not being political. So it's just been part of my entire existence. And I have really leaned into the idea that our political empowerment, our civic engagement, our ability to protect ourselves as a community, our ability to contribute back to where we are as a constituency in different local areas has really been about participating in the political process. So I was registering voters in my personal capacity. I'm a Democrat. The Institute, to be clear, is a nonpartisan organization. The president of my organization is a Democrat. The chairman is a Republican, but we're entirely nonpartisan. So my conversation here is reflective in my own personal views. And I'm a Democrat. So I was registering Arab American voters when someone came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry. I was registering voters on behalf of the Democratic Party." And someone came up to me and was like, "Why are you doing this for the Democratic Party? Why aren't you doing it for your community?" You know, as a kid in Dearborn, Michigan, my family came to Dearborn after the war, and I just had not integrated myself into a community's political structures. And when I discovered that, it was the most amazing thing, and I leaned heavily into that. I attended the Democratic Convention in 1992, my first convention ever, as a pretty young kid, and it was, as I said, it's been the path to power.
That's great to hear. Of course, we'll have a few things to say about the Democratic Party in the in the elections next month. But just in terms of the sort of the institutional sort of setting of Arab Americans, so just tell us briefly about AAI and its kind of, I suppose, sister organization to a certain extent, ADC. Like, when were these organizations created? What was the status and visibility of Arab Americans until that moment? I guess in the 1970s and 80s, I suppose, when both organizations came into being. And what is the institutional status of Arab Americans sort of today, if that makes sense?
Yeah, actually, before I would do AI and ADC, I would go back to AUG, Arab American University Graduates, which in a post 1967 reality for Arab Americans, there's been a lot of incredible writing and research and by important historians on this issue in terms of sort of dividing our arrival in this country in three different phases. But the one I love, sort of, and I got to meet Alexa Naff before she passed away, actually, but she did incredible work. And one of the things she talked about is that Arab Americans almost assimilated themselves out of existence. And it was the replenishing of some ways of the Arab identity and consciousness in the different waves of Arab Americans that came. And 67 is incredibly formative in that regard. And when you had folks that came at that time, a lot of students at that time, a lot of Palestinian Americans, a lot of Egyptian Americans, and they really, in some ways, post 67 war also politicized a community differently, I think. And the Arab American University Graduates was sort of the founding organization for us as Arab Americans. It went from there to the NAAA, was the National Arab American National Organization of Arab Americans, which was like the lobbying arm. And these were late 70s. ADC came in 1980, which is American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. The idea being we had our own institution to combat defamation. One of the co-founders of ADC was James Zogby, who, after working, this is part of the story that I think is so incredible for people to know and understand, that the Arab American identity in some ways was really crafted by a group of Arab Americans who cared deeply about a variety of issues, and part of the reason they worked on these issues was their own identity. And the role of Reverend Jesse Jackson in the formation and the creation of political power for Arab Americans is really incredible. So it was after the 1984 presidential campaign of Reverend Jackson, where the Institute was founded in 1985, specifically being political empowerment and civic engagement. When you talk about now, the state of our organizations, the AI and ADC certainly remain, but I think perhaps one of the more important things is the number of local organizations that now exist. And you really do have this incredibly rich, diverse community across the country with beautiful local institutions, both providing direct services to communities, but also making sure that the cultural and political representation piece is there.
So Maya, if I could just ask you to clarify for our viewers and listeners, I'm sure most of them know this, but for those who don't, can you just explain a little bit more when we say Arab Americans, what do we mean? Most people, of course, conflate Arab and Muslim. And, what is the difference between the ADC and the AAI that you work for and, for example, CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations? How do these things fit together? Can you just tell us a little bit more about Arab Americans in general?
Sure. So I will tell you, I am a bit of a one-trick pony on this issue, and I've been on the soapbox for a long time. It predates October 7th. I have very strong feelings about the conflation of Arab Americans with American Muslims, and it is for a variety of reasons. One is I'm a Muslim who cares deeply about making sure that we respond to anti-Muslim bigotry in this country, and boy, does it exist. So I don't want any of this conversation to suggest that it doesn't. Whenever I talk about this, and I don't use the term Islamophobia because I think it's not accurate and doesn't represent accurately what the problem is. And one can hate a faith. That's not the issue. It's when you actually when you take that and target individuals. But when we talk about these issues, I remind folks about a case in 2010 where the Justice Department actually filed a brief in a case in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, arguing that Islam was a religion. That was the position of the U.S. government, and they had to do that because there was an attempt to prevent a mosque from being built in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and the case put forward was Islam is perhaps a cult, but not a religion, therefore didn't warrant the protections that are in place for religious land use. So again, anti-Muslim bigotry, a very real problem in this country. The problem that I think sort of happens when it's conflated is it really does kind of do a disservice to the civil rights of Arab Americans in a very real and meaningful way. And I talk about it in the context of understanding that if in some ways, members of Congress and others sort of like to talk about religious liberty. They like to defend religious liberties. So they're going to be okay with this idea, even though, yes, there's an anti-Muslim problem. When you get to the Arab identity piece, when you tie it to folks that come from the Arab world, this region we're in constant conflict, right? Like it is not, it's all, and we've seen this, frankly, now in a post-October 7th, where you can talk about what's been happening and conflate it with the two. So you can talk about interfaith dialogue between Muslims and Jews, as opposed to understanding, frankly, the basic piece of this, which is that there's an occupation of Arab land. And the moment you introduce the Arab identity, and specifically the Palestinian piece, it kind of deviates away from the comfortable talking points. In terms of institutions, ADC has leaned into sort of the legal defense work in some ways. The Institute, and historically a lot of the hate crime work, you mentioned the question of why was I in the chair. The Institute published a pretty groundbreaking research in 2018 examining our nation's hate crime laws and the problem specifically with data collection and reporting. And this was my second time testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the topic of hate crimes. I co-chair, in addition to being the executive director at the Institute, I co-chair the Hate Crimes Task Force at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, specifically dealing with the issue of hate crimes. So that's the kind of one of the lanes that we tend to occupy as the institution. Muslim organizations like CARE or MPAC or others, they're focused on the representation for American Muslims. And the final point I would make on this is that I think the conflation is a challenge also for the American Muslim community in a way that really troubles me. The the American Muslim community is exceptionally diverse. Until I think 2015, a plurality were actually Black Muslims. The single largest segment of the American Muslim community is actually Latino. So part of when people say Arab/Muslim, I get frustrated because I think that's not what they mean at all. First of all, you should never say that because we're having a domestic conversation. We're having an American conversation. So the importance of leaving behind the sort of narrative from the region is I think, critical. But what they really mean to say is Arab American Muslims. And I'm an outlier in that regard, right? I am the majority of Arab Americans are Christians. I am both an immigrant. I am Muslim. And it ends up canceling and erasing communities, both in the American Muslim community as well as in the Arab American community, in a way that's not great. Sorry, I'm long-winded on that point. I've been dealing with it for a long time.
Maya, we're going to actually, Karim, sorry, I know you want to turn to the Senate in a second, but just 1 second, just to fill in.
No, I have a clarification question.
Okay, then go ahead, because I wanted to ask about the history of this too, but Karim, go ahead if you want to.
No, just a quick question about, can you just give a profile of who the Arab Americans are, in terms of, you're saying Christians, in terms of Lebanese, Egyptians, Palestinians, how they've grown, like, how are they growing, and are they becoming more politicized? Are they being forced to become more politicized, or are they? And how does, just that kind of sociologically?
Because so the question I was going to ask Maya, it was to recap something you said in passing, which is that I think historically the Arab American community was overwhelmingly Christian, and I think you just said it is still the majority Christian community. It's become more Muslim since I guess the Lebanese Civil War, like since the 70s or 80s or something. It's relatively more recent compared to the 19th century, and which is interesting. But yeah, go ahead.
It is. It continues to be majority Christian, but I think barely. We're actually in the middle of publishing an updated demographic profile. It's taken us 2 years of research on this. Partly, you mentioned the MENA category. Partly because we haven't had the ability to gather accurate data about our community ever. We used to rely on the ancestry question on the long form of the U.S. Census. That went away. So 2020 is the first time ever that we had decennial data that we can retrieve and do the research on to pull that information. So we estimate roughly 3.7 million Arab Americans. And I would tell you that based on the 2020 data that we received for the first time last year, I know that to be a serious undercount. And like I said, we're in the process of updating that. But to your point, sorry, the original immigrants for a very long time who came from Lebanon and Syria, even before Lebanon's creation as an independent state of Syria, were predominantly Christian. So you have that community and the natural growth of that community, and then you have the more recent immigrants, where yes, they have been majority Muslim. The Lebanese community continues to be a majority of Arab Americans, partly for the same reasons, having arrived much earlier. The newer immigrants. We see Iraqi immigrants, Yemeni immigrants, Egyptian immigrants, Somali immigrants, and you'll see different states. It's actually a fascinating thing and makes my job easier that the majority of Arab Americans live in just 12 key states. So when we look at the work that we need to do in terms of the organizing work that must happen, you really do see concentrations of communities in different areas. Minnesota, for example, the Somali American community there is a tremendous one. We look at Michigan frequently, and certainly the Metro Detroit area, Dearborn in particular, yes, Dearborn Heights has a huge community of Lebanese. There's also a huge community of Palestinians in the Livonia suburbs, or Egyptians in Troy. So it is, the trajectory is kind of related to what happens in the region as well, not surprisingly, right? The conflicts there tend to bring in newer immigrants. The politicization piece is also really interesting, because when they originally came here, they did their job and they wanted to provide for their families, and they would send money back to the old country. We were peddlers, and we worked with our grocery stores, and we had a lot of religious-based and cultural village-based organizations. The reason I talk so much about the 67 war is like that group of Arab Americans really politicized the larger community in a very real and meaningful way. And I think you've seen the continuation of that. Partly, Arab nationalism never worked in the region, right? Like it's not a thing, but I suggest that it is an identity here in America. Like it didn't, it did take hold in a way. There is a sense of Arab identity here and a cultural that we're proud of. So that's the positive piece. The other negative piece, frankly, is that, government policies have targeted us with as a securitized community. We were viewed through a lens of national security in a way that even if you didn't think you were Arab American and you boarded a flight, in 2000 on your way to a rugby, it wasn't rugby, it was a rowing match, a Rutgers student on his way to a rowing match. And you were treated differently. If you're a member of Congress who gets treated differently, if you're the Secretary of Health and Human Services and you get profiled and treated differently, these things kind of tend to reinforce your identity.
Maya, just again, a follow-up. There's so many questions that I want to ask, but again, on the question of, you mentioned a handful of states where basically Arab Americans tend to be focused. I mean, we hear a lot about Minnesota because of Ilhan Omar and the kind of Somalis that she represents. Michigan obviously is in the news a lot. I think we'll come back to that. But can you just remind me at least, what are the others, at least the other kind of key states, and which kind of communities are there? And then sort of separately, has it changed? You're saying part of the change is the fact that whether the Arab Americans like it or not, they've become more securitized. So they are a securitized community. Is there conflict among the Arab Americans in that sense? Are there some who just want to be white, so to speak, and just sort of move away from that, and others who are just very clearly like fresh off the boat, so to speak, so they can't get away from it? How is that like inter-Arab American kind of thing working?
Yeah, I love that question, Kareem. We did focus groups going into the 2020 decennial census. We do a lot of polling. We've been polling since the mid-90s. Actually, both our work on the demographics work as well as our hate crime work, we tend to really rely on data. That's kind of a big piece of our policymaking efforts. And in 2020, in addition to a national poll, we did specific focus groups. And I can't go to Detroit to do a focus group. That's considerably, it's a different thing, right? So it's like, that doesn't work. So we did them in different places, right? Peoria, Illinois, and Miami, upstate New York. And for example, the group in Miami would very much fit into what you just said, which is like, I am super white passing. There's no reason for me to kind of be connected with this, versus the group that were in upstate New York, very recently arrived Syrian refugees who were there. And it was fascinating because we asked the question at the time, if you recall, there was a whole piece about vetting, the amount of vetting that needed to take place before immigrants could be allowed in, and the conversation around the Muslim ban. Well, not at that point, it had been in place. So there was a lot of that was taking place. And the folks from that focus group, the folks in upstate New York, were like, they had been vetted for 2.5 years before they came in. So they're like, the government can have all my data, anything it wants. I'm fine. No, I'm not threatened by these intrusive questions. I'm not threatened by profiling. It's appropriate to keep us safe. It was the group in Miami who are 3-4 generations in who were like, no, that's discriminatory and wrong. So they're really, it's very comforting to the work I do to see that there is that continued linkage. In terms of the number of states, the key ones I would point out that tend to be electorally important are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia. And they tend to be sort of equally distributed. I wouldn't point to one as having a bigger concentration than the other. Michigan is, like I said, gets a lot because it's true in terms of Lebanese, Minnesota in terms of Palestinians. I'm sorry, in terms of Somalis, but the other ones are, places like New York, New Jersey, Florida, Illinois. So it does make our work much, much easier. And actually not just in key states, but also in metropolitan areas. Like it's just a more urban population in that regard. In California, of course.
In California and Texas, no? Is there
Of course.
not a big community
Absolutely.
in
Huge
Texas?
community in Texas. Yes.
Texas, yeah. So because in Texas, where I was teaching for 25 years, there's a huge Arab American community that established all these chairs in Houston in particular. So, but a quick question, Maya, in terms of what you were saying in terms of the Arab American community as opposed to the Muslim American community, I'm just wondering, the question of Palestine, you alluded to this earlier in the answer you gave, has been central to Arab American identity formation really from the 40s onwards, really, in a sense. And it's hard to sort of think of ADC, think of your AEI, think of virtually all these organizations. They always come back to, whether they like it or not, they come back to the question of Palestine, or they're forced back into the question of Palestine. How does the current situation now, the genocide in Gaza, the extraordinarily aggressive sort of overt U.S. policy, how does that actually shape being Arab American today, as far as you can tell?
The founders of the Institute, Jim Zogby and Helen Samham, published a scholarly paper at the time, coining the term the politics of exclusion. We were, as a community, not welcome into the civic engagement table because of our advocacy on the issue of Palestinian human rights. So there were anti-war coalitions, there were civil rights coalitions. The Institute was not allowed to be member of important Washington, D.C. based policy organizations because of our advocacy on the issue of Palestinian human rights. So you're 100% right when you point that it's a foundational issue for Arab Americans and has been. I recently, when you look at the Penn League in New York, and there were certainly Palestinians that were part of that important, but so was Amin Rouhani and so was Khalil Gibran, and they were working on that issue. It transcends that piece for Arab Americans, and always has. And that is the reason why I try to emphasize the importance of getting it right in terms of the Arab part of the Arab American identity, as opposed to conflating it with the issue of faith. The experience I had at the hearing is a clear demonstration of that. And when a Muslim judge, highly qualified Muslim judge, came before the same committee last year, and they've held up his nomination as a process, he was asked inappropriate questions of a nominee for sure. And the issue, though, is he was asked about Palestine. So he may be a South Asian Muslim, but the questions that they came to attack him with didn't relate to necessarily, how do you practice your faith? What are the issues? Do you worry about this? It was, what is your position on foreign policy related issues that they deem related to Palestine? So that's a critical piece of this. And as you ask your question correctly about what we're seeing today, that's why I've talked a lot about a post-October 7th, where President Biden's administration has chosen to talk about anti-Semitism and what they deem Islamophobia, specifically so that you don't talk about the way that Arab Americans are being targeted for their advocacy. So you don't talk about Palestinian Americans being targeted. And it's extraordinary, because I think we've been given this false binary about, like, people not understanding, like, how could your community support Trump? Don't you see the threats to our democracy? And I've pointed out that, first of all, it's a false binary, because yes, my community, in my community has never been a single issue constituency. When we do polling on this, we have never, ever said we focus exclusively on foreign policy. Although I will tell you, in the poll that we just did, 81% of Arab Americans said Gaza is impacting their vote. 81%. So clearly we're not in normal times, including the issue of democracy. But I would point out, and I do frequently to my partners in the civil rights space, that there have been a lot of threats to our democracy that have come out in a post-October 7th environment, specifically to shut down pro-Palestine speech. And it's targeted Arab Americans, it's targeted progressive Jewish students, it's targeted the Black community, it's targeted everybody who has chosen to lean in on the issue of Palestine.
And if I just may quickly, just a follow-up on that, Maya, it's also the fact that, is it not that there's a convergence? I mean, so it seems to me like in places like Florida, Karim, you pointed this out in our last show, in places like Florida, there's a right-wing attack, sort of an extreme anti-immigrant, anti-DEI, anti-all these things in places like Florida and Texas. But then in the Democratic states, there's, as you said, there's a censorship of speech and based all on this question of Palestine and advocating for Palestine. So it's coming from two different sides, and that must make your work even more challenging.
It does. The movements on attempting to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel and Zionism have taken form in a post-October 7th in a way that links back to the national security state being frankly deployed an attempt to do that. At the same hearing, you saw the gentleman sitting next to me testifying multiple times, talked about invoking the INA specifically to go after students, suggesting that they are providing material support for terrorist organizations. Material support is how we got to the LA8, the incredibly a long example of 8 Palestinian students and sorry, 7, and one of them, their Kenyan wife, being targeted specifically for protected political activity and political speech. When they're trying to invoke the IRS right now, there really isn't. There's legislation in Congress to allow the Secretary of the Treasury to revoke the 501c3 status of organizations that they deem outside the realm of what is acceptable speech on the issue of Palestine. I am reminded of the fact that the AUG back then in the late 70s was facing similar issues with the IRS. So the playbook is there. What's different now is that it is coming at you from such an extraordinary number of places. And you all know that the university experience is a particularly devastating one right now.
Maya, I mean, let's just to go back to that congressional testimony. I mean, it was extraordinary for all kinds of reasons. First of all, because it's like in response to one of the first questions, like Senator Kennedy, I think his name was, like the first thing you said was, "Thank you for asking that." He was asking a very racist question, and your response was, "Thank you for asking that question," because that's what we're here to talk about. Of course, he didn't want to talk about that. He wanted to talk about other things, but they all seem to have this thing about yes no questions or yes no answers that that's a whole other story, I guess, because Stefanik did that in the hearings with the presidents of the universities in the last fall. But when we go on to the culminating moment when he was getting, I don't know what he was expecting. I honestly have no idea what was going on in that guy's head, but whatever it was, at the very end, for him to say, "You should put your head in a bag," there's something. The first, and you could hear the room gasping. By the way, it was very, very audible. The whole room gasped. That is something that as far as I can tell, you tell me. You're the expert in this. I don't think that would happen to the member of any other racial group in the United States in a congressional hearing. Maybe in back alleys and bars and things like that. Like or in people's private rooms, maybe. But I don't think any other racial group would be subjected to that kind of racist abuse in the full view of the nation, in the Democratic chamber of the United States Senate. Like to me, it seems unthinkable that would happen to any other racial group. So is that your sense too? That there's something specific about Arab American identity, whether or not in his weird imagination, I think it is conflated with Muslim and Arabs. I suppose in his warped view of the world, they are interchangeable. But the point is, there's something specific there. So let's unpack that moment. Let's see what is it about Arab American identity that is so specific, that not just that it has this trajectory, but that it remains to this day the only form of racism that can be spoken aloud in settings like that. Not that obviously other communities have of course, racism is alive and well against Black people, against Indigenous Americans, and so on. That's clear, right? But there's something specific about this racism and the public visibility that it has that's different from I think it's different from other forms of racism. So what do you make of that?
I think that's right. I think it's both the visibility that it has and the policy that's associated with it. Anti-Arab racism, first of all, it had to be erased. Like, let's just be clear about that. The idea that we even have, like, I have to fight to call it that, folks. And that's something that says a lot, I think. So first, there's the complete erasure of it, and then needing to acknowledge that that's what's playing out here, and having it come from policymakers is an extraordinary thing. And then having it translate to disparate impact of U.S. policies on communities is also a thing. When I have these conversations with folks, I repeatedly say, you are wonderful with your understanding of the U.S. Constitution until it hits a wall relating to terrorism. And because you see my community, not in the civil rights space, but in the counterterrorism space, my rights can be compromised in ways that you would not allow for other communities. And until we are in a different place on that issue, none of us in this country are going to be safe and protected. You know, people talk about, just a note on the hearing itself. I've now testified one, two, three, I think at 4 congressional hearings. Literally one of the least favorite things I can ever do. You sit in front of a box with a timer. It has a red, green, and red light, and the timer ticks down. Each member has 5 minutes, and they can reclaim their time at any time. And when I say to you that I was sitting in a space where the Democrats are on one side, the Republicans on the others. The Democrats asked questions about the subject of the hearing. The Republicans all engaged in performative, pro-Israel, bizarre. I don't know how to explain it other than to say they were not there to talk about hate crime. They were there to yell at Democrats about, we demanded a hearing on anti-Semitism. You're giving us this. And they wanted a replay of what happened with the university presidents. They wanted the House hearings, and the House has had multiple hearings like this. And I'm frankly very grateful for the, Senator Durbin and the Democratic leadership to say there needs to be a hearing, because we're seeing, we haven't talked about this yet. From 2015 on, this country has been breaking a record each year with regards to hate crime. It is not okay. We have a massive underreporting problem with regards to hate, but each year for the last 3 years, we've broken records for almost every community across the board. So I showed up. The federal data had not been released yet, and to be clear, we only rely on the federal data. Sorry, Kareem, go ahead.
So just can you clarify what happened 25? You've mentioned 2015 a few times. What does it happen?
Presidential election, Donald Trump's presidential election. Anti-Muslim hate crime, highest ever, was post 9/11. Second year after that was the fall of 2016, that presidential election, when there were conversations about a Muslim ban. When now we talk about Springfield, Ohio, and the Haitian community, I will be able to look at the data in 25 for 2024 and find a spike in hate crime targeting that community. It's not a direct correlation, but there's no question that when policymakers dehumanize a community like this, it has an impact. So we've seen that increase from 2015 on related to that presidential election. And the piece of the issue at that hearing is that, I just want to be clear on this point, though. It didn't start with Kennedy. Kennedy was like the most bizarre, but it was the ranking member. Ranking member Graham actually said to me, this is quite extraordinary. He had this, he asked the question, do you believe, he had this like a series of questions. Do you believe Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran are seeking the destruction of the Jewish state? And the reason I hate hearing so much is that because my brain doesn't work like that. It's like literally the first thing I hear is, well, you didn't say Israel, you said Jewish state. And then I start running through, well, this one changed its charter in 17. This one hasn't, but I don't know. The idea of actually having a substantive conversation is what you think you should do. That's not what they have in mind. And I opened my mouth by saying, Senator, that's a complicated question. What I was trying to say, it's a complicated foreign policy question that doesn't belong on a hearing on hate crime. Would not let me finish, literally said to me that my answer, I think what he said is that my answer is the worst answer he'd ever heard in that committee, and that I had nothing to say he needed to hear. That's what started us off. That was Senator Graham. Then we went through Senator Hawley, who used taxpayer funds to blow up pictures of student protests, suggesting I was uncomfortable multiple times, but I was really uncomfortable sitting in that chair trying to suggest that I have some reason to weigh in on what is and is not hate speech, when the conversation wasn't even hate speech. It was actually about hate crime. But you have very little, ability as a witness, any witness. You only speak when you're spoken to. You respond only to their questions. And it's a challenge to have a substantive conversation, but that's not regrettably what the folks on the Republican side decided to do. And then you got to Kennedy.
So the question was really, is there a spike? There's been a spike, you said, from 2015 of anti-Arab and I assume also anti-Muslim hate crimes. And also I was reading your testimony, the actual document that you submitted to Congress. There's also been a spike of anti-Semitism as well. Can you tell me or explain to our viewers and listeners how it is that these are being tracked? In other words, what's the definition that's being used in these three different sort of instances?
Yeah. So the anti-Arab one is actually way more complicated than we might have time for, but I have to answer it. I'll do my best to do it super quickly because it goes back to the erasure point. But before I do that, I actually want to address your point of why are we in the chair? And I actually think, as difficult as this experience has been, the why we're in the chair is part of what triggers the kind of response that we got. I was there as a subject matter expert. The Arab American Institute has done important work in this space. So when it was time to invite people to testify on the subject, we're at the point where the Arab American Institute is who should testify. And I'm incredibly proud of that as a community. This is, as you can imagine, it takes a lot to get to a place where the work that we're doing is what's valued, and the fact that we're Arab Americans is in some ways incidental to it. The issue of the whether it's Senator Graham or Kennedy or Hawley or any of them that came at me the way that they did is because they actually couldn't see an Arab American as a subject matter expert. They could only see me as an Arab American that they attempted to link me to terrorism. Like, it was a very simple linear line that can draw. It says so much more about them than it does about our community. And it is, to me, I think, something that's incredibly important. So it's one of my least favorite things to do in the whole wide world, but doing difficult work is how we fight for our community. And that includes appearing in spaces like this. So that I just feel the need to kind of, highlight that piece of it. The second thing, actually, I should also note on this is there were years where this would have happened and nobody would have come to our defense. In fact, there were years where this happened and nobody came to our defense. Very specific examples. And I think one of the other heartening things during this process is the extraordinary support that we've received from our partners in the civil rights space, who've leaned in and said that's not acceptable. And it's been overwhelming and wonderful. So that too, I'm not taking for granted.
Sorry, Maya, sorry, just on that, just quickly, just to reinforce that, the gasp in the room was audible, right? So clearly there's something here is out of whack, right? Yeah, it wouldn't have happened to anybody else, but people realize, or some people, or more people realize, or more people realize there's something wrong with what we just saw happening. So just
Also, sorry. Also, can you just, because I'm maybe not tracking it as much as my brothers are, when you say that there was a solidarity, I'm very curious who and was it made public, and
Yeah.
how is the solidarity expressed, and what about other Congress people and other senators that may or may not have been on that? I mean, was there any censure to these kinds of people, to this kind of, it's racist also, frankly. I mean, I see it also as this kind of series of patriarchal people talking to a woman as well. I mean, doesn't that also come into this? And are there feminist women's groups, etc., that also oppose this?
Yeah. I mean, in a moment of being glib, I did say to someone, because they're like, how could you have sit there? How did you sit there so calmly? And I said, this wasn't my first time experiencing white men being white men. I understood what was happening in that moment. And it's unfortunate. And I don't mean to be, I'm not drawing mass generalizations, but there's an element of that here without a doubt. The support has been very public. Major institutions have, look, I'm old. I've been in this town now for a long time. I moved to DC in 1995. And, we have spent a lot of time working with partners. We're there for other communities when they've been targeted. So it's been very heartening to see folks coming in the way that they have. And that has been public. I've gotten a few calls from some senators and some other members who were, I think, more private in theirs, but there are also members of Congress who were very public. So it's, like I said, I think there's something is different about this. The gasp, though, I just to note this, part of the reason for the gasp is not just like how crazy he landed, like he was on a trajectory. It's also, at least for me, the part of it that's like, what is happening here? Sitting right behind me was Wadia's mother. Wadia was brutally killed in Chicago, the 6-year-old boy, immediately after October, stabbed 26 times. She lost her son. She was personally stabbed 12 times. a few chairs down was a family from the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh who lost their mother and their grandmother. I mean, we were there to have a conversation about hate crime. And they did this bizarre performative, I'm going to be more pro-Israeli than you are, and let's engage in this. That, I think, even for me, I mean, Osama, you mentioned reading my testimony. You'll note in my testimony, I say, guys, you may want to lean into this conversation. Let's avoid that. Let's try to bring it back, anticipating that there might be some of that. But even I didn't anticipate it would be as bad as it was. In terms of the increase in hate, the data point, the anti-Arab category, let me start. 1990 is when the Hate Crime Statistics Act was passed in the United States. And it's the first time that we said we've got to collect hate crime data. And to be clear, it's not about hate speech. It's not about discrimination. Hate crime, to define it clearly, first there has to be a criminal offense, and then you would have to have targeted the individual based on a protected category. Arab Americans were part of the reason the Hate Crime Statistics Act passed in 1990. There was a historic hearing held in 1985 after the murder of Alex Oda, the incredible Arab American civil rights hero who was killed in his office at the ADC office in California. The FBI director back then literally referred to Arabs or those holding Arab views as being within the quote unquote zone of danger. That was how we got, in some ways, to the Hate Crime Statistics Act passing, is this understanding that there is this problem in our country and we need to gather better data about it in order to inform our policy. That happens in 1990. The first time the hate crime data collection is reported in 1991. And when it was created, there was Code 31, which is the anti-Arab category. The anti-Arab category was completely eliminated. It disappeared from the data collection. It was not reintroduced until 2015. So for decades, there was no collection about anti-Arab hate, even though Code 31—
Right around 9/11 too, of course, right? Or after 9/11. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Missed all of the 9/11, missed all of the incredible stuff that happened during the Gulf War. I mean, it's extraordinary. And
so Maya, I'm sorry to interrupt, but how does that happen? Yes. How does the category just get deleted? I mean, is it an accident, or is it a deliberate decision that's made somewhere?
It's definitely not an accident. That the FBI put out guidance to the states saying they could not report Code 31. So everything they were going to report was going to put under other ethnic. The explanation at the time was, I mean, I shouldn't say the explanation at the time. The explanation that we've been able to understand is that based on the 1997 race and ethnicity standards, the point that we were talking about with regards to a new MENA category, Arabs are automatically classified within the white racial category. Therefore, they eliminated Code 31. The problem with that explanation is the race and ethnicity standards were changed this year. And the category was reintroduced in 2015. So it makes no sense. Nothing happened between 1997 and 2015 that would explain why it wasn't there and then there now. And the importance of understanding that is that local law enforcement is the source of this data. The local law enforcement will collect it, goes up to the states, and then goes up to the FBI. And when something is reported as a hate crime, does not mean it's automatically prosecuted that way. The reason we have, we wrote the Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer No Hate Act, which is incredibly important legislation that was passed in 2021, specifically to address the issue of underreporting and missed hate crime data. And the reason it's named Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer is that Khalid Jabara was an Arab American who was killed on his front porch in Oklahoma by his next door neighbor in a huge high-profile hate crime. Heather Heyer is the young woman who was killed in Charlottesville in a huge high-profile hate crime. Both of them did not end up in the hate crime data. So when we brought that to the attention of policymakers and formulated that bill to attempt to kind of improve that problem of hate crime data collection and reporting, that's how we got to that. But the reason I come back to it now in the context of not conflating with Muslim and the importance of separating them out is when we looked at the 2023 data, and to be clear, by the way, the other thing that was annoying about what happened at the hearing is the federal data had not been released yet. And we only rely on federal data. I don't, there may be interesting anecdotal information that can come from organizations, but I would say to you that organizations have definitions that they apply that are not credible. And therefore, we would never use anything other than formal government data, which is why we lean in so heavily to getting it right. When we looked at the 2023 data, Wadia's case was reported as a hate crime. That's good. Wadia's case was reported exclusively as an anti-Muslim hate crime, when it should have been reported both as anti-Muslim and anti-Arab, because the alleged perpetrator spoke specifically about wanting to harm Palestinians. That's a problem when that gets missed in the data. The three young Arab American students in Vermont who were wearing a keffiyeh and occasionally speaking Arabic, they were not reported at all in the hate crime data in Vermont. That's missing entirely. And while I understand I'm happy to explain why it might be difficult to prosecute in that case a hate crime, it's not difficult to capture it in the data. They very much feel like they were targeted for being Palestinian. Like that's part of their experience that they had there. So yes, it's about data. Yes, it's about categories, but it's also important in terms of we cannot diagnose a problem correctly if we don't understand it. And if we're going to like sweep all this into different categories and not talk about the issue at hand, we're not going to be able to address the crux of this, which is anti-Arab racism and very much tied to Palestinian issues.
Maya, just in contrast, I mean, I frankly, I'm listening to this, and I'm really, it's incredibly difficult just to hear this, and the way in which this is kind of basically erasure of all these attacks and hate crimes, specifically of Arab Americans, Palestinians and Lebanese and others. But can we contrast this as well to what I keep reading about, which is this hugely expanding category of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hate crimes, where that so it's the opposite, right, of the Arab American thing, which is shrinking or at times excluded. Here, it's every time every little thing becomes categorized as anti-Jewish. Can you explain this? And how and are you working with these kinds of anti-Semitic organizations that are defending against anti-Semitism? Is there a working together, or are these in opposition to each other? Is it competitive?
No. So the wonderful thing about all this is that we work a great deal in the civil rights space as a coalition. One of the reasons that I didn't think it was smart to do a strategy exclusively on anti-Semitism, and nor did I think it was smart to do a strategy on quote unquote Islamophobia. As a civil rights community, we've been very clear that hate is intersectional and our response ought to be the same. So that it goes without saying that, yes, there is a real community that comes together on these issues. The definition, though, I want to be clear on this point, the definition of an anti-Jewish hate crime is the same as the definition of, say, an anti-Arab hate crime, right? It's a criminal offense, but then you're targeted because of that protected category. That's the same with anti-Black race, anti-LGBTQ, all of that plays out. So when we have this conversation about, are we seeing a surge in hate crimes the answer is undoubtedly yes. There was a 63% increase between 22 and 23 in terms of anti-Jewish hate crimes. You saw the increase in the Arab American community as well, 34%.
But Mike, can you also just clarify about the anti-Jewish? You said for year 22-23, it spiked by, I think you said 60% or so. These are what's the explanation in that particular period?
The ADL says it spiked by 6,000%, but of course they mean if you see somebody wearing a keffiyeh, that's anti-Semitism as far as they're concerned. So this comes back to the question about whose data. Yeah, whose data? What counts as data, even, right?
This is why I'm so critical about relying on government data. The ADL. I want to be clear on this point. As an Arab American, I'm keenly aware of the role that the ADL has played in the suppression of my community. I have sitting on my bookshelf the profiles that they used to publish on Arab Americans, from Professor Edward Said to Ibrahim Abulghud to Jim Zogby, the current president of the Institute.
Can you explain ADL? Can you just
the anti-defamation?
is?
Yeah, the anti-defamation. It's an organization that was founded in the early 1900s, actually, specifically to address the very real problem of defamation against the Jewish community. And the point I make is that I mentioned Jabara Hire as an important piece of legislation, but Matthew Shepard, James Byrd Hate Crimes Act is even more important in that it expanded our ability to address the issue of hate crimes and gave us a more inclusive definition. That bill would not have passed were it not for the work of the ADL. So it's this strange role that they occupy in certain spaces on things, but yet if you are an Arab American and you understand the role that they've played with regards to our community and specifically silencing pro-Palestinian advocacy for decades, then you understand the more recent positions, which is that they redefined anti-Semitism. Sometimes when I go into spaces, I'm like, you want me to define anti-Semitism? First of all, you don't need to define it. No other form of hate is actually defined. We know anti-Semitism when we see it. We know what anti-Black racism looks like. We know what homophobia looks like. So this idea that if someone is coming at you with define it, that a flag should go up because that means there's a political agenda in play here. The second piece is when they do attempt to define it, they've now decided to prioritize the pro-Israel work against some of the work that they did in the civil rights space. So they've now defined it not just criticism of Israel, but also criticism of the political ideology of Zionism. So the ADL is not a credible source of data on this issue, even though it's unfortunate you'll continue to see some members of Congress who use it. But I will tell you that they've leaned into this so much, to your point, a keffiyeh at a protest, that I think they've harmed their own standing in that space. But we've tried for a long time to make that point. And I will say, I don't like people using, I won't be popular for saying I don't use CARE data either. I don't use any data that comes from any organization. We rely exclusively on data that is generated from government sources. And then back to
But Maya, sorry, but if that's the case, but you just said, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying about the ADL and the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism to the point where it becomes an almost, they, as you said, they're harming the actual fight against actual anti-Semitism, because of course they've become essentially an advocacy organization for Israel, and they're at the ADL is at the forefront of defaming our students of all faiths who are standing up against the genocide. But when you say you rely on federal data, but you said earlier in this conversation that the federal data itself is extraordinarily selective and has erased Arabs, for a long period. So what does it mean to rely on federal data? It's like as if we're saying we have to rely on the very system that has erased us. So how do you square that circle for us? Can you explain that to our viewers?
not just erased us, but dramatically underreporting all communities. The Department of Justice's own Bureau of Justice Statistics says that roughly 1% of hate crimes are actually reported. So when we get the annual data and it says 11,683 for 2023, imagine that that's about 1% of all hate crimes occurring in the country. So I'm making your point even stronger for you, and to say it's not even just us, it's all communities. But what I come back to is the importance of understanding that the First Amendment is a beautiful thing. And I am not interested in policing people's speech. I am not even interested. I'm having a conversation as an individual. When the far right folks are brought to campuses, I was never one of those folks who said, shut down those meetings and don't allow them. I think the way you respond is to offer counter speech. I think you have more conversations. So it's imperative that the conversation remain about hate crime and not stuff that hurts my feelings or makes me uncomfortable. And I don't mean to be glib about it. I mean, it's truly important that it remain that way. The second point that makes your point is communities have huge discrepancies in reporting. Arab Americans have a history post-Gulf War in the 90s, when Arab Americans were facing very real challenges and would report a hate crime, the FBI would show up to take information about this hate crime, but then they would ask them about others in the community. And did you see this? And did you see? And to point that the point Sari was making about how public it was public. The FBI would tell you, we have two purposes right now. We need to protect this community, but we also need to combat terrorism. If you come at a community like that and you've compromised its trust in law enforcement, then that community is not likely to report hate crimes. So there's a ton of reasons for why we need to look at this data and say, oh boy, is this a problem? But I'm looking at trajectories. I'm looking at year to year. I'm looking at better understanding of I can't rely just on the anecdotal. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we do that. So it is a deeply flawed process. It really does require major improvements, but it also does tell a story from year to year.
Maya, there's so much more to be said here, but we want to move to the election. But I just wanted one more passing thing about, so to speak, about Arab Americans and whiteness and so forth. Because I mean, you know better than I do. But for our our listeners and viewers who don't know, for a long time, Arab Americans were counted as white. I think you're going to correct me now, but I think now there's a MENA category, Middle Eastern or North African category, I think. But I remember distinctly in the 2000 census when I was in Chicago, I remember the slogan circulated by Arab American activists then was, "Check it right, you ain't white," right? We're like, which of course we're not white. So Arab Americans exist in this anomalous sphere of being a racialized minority, but that doesn't even have a category of its own. Or you as a Muslim American, Arab American, experience certain forms of racism. We as Christian American, Arab Americans, we get it. It's like it's different because we get targeted as though we're Muslim when even we're not even Muslim, right? So all these conflations are amazing. So in terms of, are we white or are we MENA or what are we at this point? What box do we check next time we see one of these damn boxes to check? And then we'll shift to the elections.
So continuing on my tour to make everybody unhappy, I will say the following. So Arab Americans are white. Arab Americans are Black. Arab Americans are brown. The whole issue of trying to understand this is because this is the battle that we had with the Census Bureau, who's been an amazing partner on this road. They know that there's a massive underreporting problem, so they wanted to improve the category. But we have advocated for Middle East and North Africa as an ethnic category, never as a racial category, because the whole point is that the regime that existed was that Arab Americans were automatic. I would check off. We ran a campaign in 2020 that told people to check off other and then write in how they identify. That automatically, the Census Bureau would take what I wrote and put me in the white category. I tell this story all the time. I have 2 kids in my local school district. I have never checked white. I don't identify as white, but many do. Okay. I have never checked off a white box. In my local school district, one of my kids was white and one of them was Asian. And the reason for that is that because I had filled out other and put in Arab American, one got coded as white, one got coded as Asian. That's the way in which, we've come to this. So the whole point is we're an ethnicity and it's a racially diverse category. One of the biggest problems with the way the race and ethnicity standards were released is, frankly, they're erasing Black Arabs. And that's not okay for us either. We have to make sure that the community in its full diversity is represented. So the new standards do create this new category. It's part of a combined race and ethnicity question. So as an Arab American, you would check MENA and then you would write in your country of origin, because we want to make sure that we have that. And you can check any racial category you may identify with or not at all, depending on how you identify. So that's the major development that we finally have secured. There's more work to be done, to be clear. That includes the way in which it was released. Everything that applies to us is a little different, right? The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has never released race and ethnicity standards with prescribed checkboxes. They did in this case, and they didn't do it based on research. So there's need to address that, and there's work to be done going into the 2020-30 decennial. So that's the first point, is the understanding the racial diversity of the community. It's not that we're not white, it's that we're an ethnic constituency, an ethnic community. And we should be able to kind of identify that way. And I also struggle when people, sort of take the religious component to it. As you know, that thankfully the census and the U.S. government does not ask a question about religion. And when we pull demographic data, I have a full-time job of literally talking to reporters, not just the ridiculous headlines that get written, but the understanding of, you're looking at demographic data about an ethnic constituency, and then you're choosing to take that data and refer to them as Muslims. It's like the amount of erasure that's taking place there. is extraordinary. And again, erasing entirely Black Muslims, Latinos, South Asian Muslims. Arabs are a small percentage of the American Muslim community. So it's just an extraordinary erasure that takes place there. I think that's what you asked. Was there anything that I missed in that part?
Maya, I want to get to sort of to wrap this up, to talk about the elections, because obviously that's coming up very soon, and it's very heated. And in light of what's going on in Gaza, and now in the genocide in Gaza, and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and of destruction of parts of Beirut, and kind of terrorizing of the Lebanese population, with over 1 million displaced, etc. And as you said, and as we know, Michigan and Ohio and other places like this have direct connections with what's going on, and other places maybe I'm less familiar with. So the question is, we see some of the polls that are showing that Democrat Biden originally, and now kind of Kamala Harris, that the numbers are going down. That places like Michigan, Jill Stein, who's the Green Party candidate, numbers are going up. We have the uncommitted kind of movement or category. I'm not sure what they are, category, if it's a movement or whatever it is. Maybe you can explain it. But basically, there's a lot of opposition to what would normally be the Democratic Party, which is understandable at one level. But also, so if you can talk about that, but also get to the other thing that people like Mehdi Hassan and others who are, this is this very kind of poisonous debate that takes place on social media and other places where, if somebody says, I'm not going to vote Democrat, I might vote Jill Stein or undecided or any of these categories, they get accused of being a Trump enabler. In other words, it's because of you that Trump will win, and therefore everything that Trump does anytime after that will be on you and your fault because you're the one who brought them in. How does, as an Arab American and as a Lebanese American and as Palestinian Americans and as any other kind of Arab Americans, what's going on, and how does one deal with that dilemma?
Yeah. So I would start by saying that, I mentioned this already, we've been polling on the community since the mid-90s, and ours are scientific representative samples or polls. If I polled my membership, I guarantee you, if I just polled the Arab American Institute's membership, I guarantee you the poll would not come out 42% for Trump, 41% for Harris. They would not come out 38% Republican ID, 38% Democratic ID. That is what came out last week in the poll that we just released. We just released the Arab American vote in 2024. It is a marked decline in Democratic support. And it is, when we released it, two things happened. The first is the right came out celebrating it, which just crushes me because I'm just speaking personally here, including with their bigotry that they're deploying and their anti-Semitism that they're deploying in these communities. It's Pennsylvania and Michigan. Those are the two that are part of the wall. And we have sizable communities in both. So in both Pennsylvania and Michigan, you are seeing ads funded by Republican super PACs that put out information saying Harris and her Jewish husband in front of an Israeli flag, continue to stand with Israel. And they're getting mailed to Arab American voters. In Pennsylvania, they're putting out ads saying Kamala Harris is so pro-Palestinian, and it has the Palestinian flag behind it, and it's getting sent to the Jewish community. So to me, that's anti-Semitism to me, right? That's extraordinary, and it's wrong, and it's a level of disinformation that we frankly have not faced. We do a great deal of work on mis and disinformation, and we're still in real time trying to figure out how to deal with that. So that's one aspect of it. The second part of it is that there were some membership surveys that were put out who were like, majority of Arab Americans are going to vote for Jill Stein. What that misses is that about a third of Arab Americans are Republicans and have historically been Republican. It's generally about a third, and a third independent. We're like the perfect constituency to court because the party ID is fluid. They will back candidates based on issues, and they will, if you can successfully appeal to them on those issues, it works. One of the frustrating things with the 42, it's within the margin of error, 42 to 41%, is people read that and said, not only are you destroying our democracy, the point that you're making, but also there was this element of like, oh, well, this is not surprising. They're bigots. They don't want the LGBTQ this, or and in the same exact poll, because we're familiar that the group that gave us Sharia law as a threat is the same group that gave us LGBTQ book bans as a threat. We have polled on this issue, and 67% and 73% of Arab Americans reject the book bans. They are worried about those big bans. And we ask about it in the context of both the Black history as well as LGBTQ. And they come out in a majority saying, yes, I am concerned about that. This last poll, because the new thing now is DEI, we asked about DEI. It's like 73% are concerned about the way this issue plays out. So you can't claim this is a community that is coming from a place of hate on these issues. So why do you get to a place where Trump, who literally allowed the annexation of the Golan Heights, who literally put in place the Muslim ban, who would do extraordinary, like horrible things in this space, I think it's just sheer anger. I think I go back to the issue of, yes, I am worried about our democratic institutions. The hearing that we're all talking about is a product of our democratic institutions failing, small d democracy failing. The same thing is said when you've spent a year watching US policy enable a genocide in Gaza, watch it expanding to Lebanon. I mean, the number of medical workers that have been killed in Lebanon since the beginning of this, it's difficult to not see a similar playbook playing out. Their control of the airport, the fact that they've decided a blockade on the sea. Tell me how it's not Gaza, right? Like there are elements of this that are playing out that are very similar. And the democracy point goes to the majority of Americans, not just Arab Americans, do not want this. The majority of Americans have demanded a ceasefire. They do not want US weapons being used. So how is it that we haven't been able to effectively impact the policy? And that, to me, is the reason that you see the repression that you're seeing. It's the reason we're talking about changing IRS laws. It's the reason that we are curtailing speech on campuses in an unprecedented way, and attempting to do all of these things. It's the reason law firms are announcing we will review someone's social media profile. It's the reason a tenured professor was fired for there's extraordinary amount of repression happening, and it's happening as a product of how much change has been underway. And the whole thing about you're destroying our democracy is one, just intellectually incredibly dishonest, and two, if I may be so crude, just stupid. The amount of stuff that's been playing out since Trump, the amount of it was the Biden administration before Harris, right? It was the Biden administration who went and said that the debates don't need to go through the Presidential Debate Commission. I think that means something. I think there are many ways in which both parties are not honoring the democratic institutions and the democratic traditions that we really need to cling to save our democracy.
Just a question to clarify. Is Trump more of a threat to Arab Americans, and you can even increase to Muslim Americans, frankly, but to Arab Americans, than Harris and all these people who are ideologically or basically subject to AIPAC and all those kinds of things. So on the questions of Lebanon, Palestine, etc., but who are presumably more decent in the domestic setting. So, and if so, and you're worried that Trump will come back with his Muslim ban and his Arab ban and his anti-Palestinian bans and all of that. I'm talking just domestically, not foreign kind of policy even. How do you, again, this kind of dilemma of if you don't vote for the Democrats, you may be, because Michigan might literally be or at least as I understand it, might be the tipping point one way or the other, maybe Pennsylvania as well. And the Arab Americans will be blamed for that. Then Trump will come in if he wins. And they don't care about the Arab Americans either, so they're going to come in and do their thing anyway. So so you're either going to vote for an administration that has been pushed genocide, continues and refuses to even. It's not even pushing genocide; they refuse to even put just a tiny bit of compassion or a tiny bit of outreach, as far as I understand, to Michigan and places like this. Or you're going to vote for a guy who you just know is going to come after the domestic communities and the Arabs, etc. So how do you personally and others deal with this who have to go through this?
Yellow Vote is a program we put together in 1988 for civic engagement. It's nonpartisan. We've never told people how to vote. We just put the resources in their hands and say, this is what the issues are, and you all run with it. We're doing that again, but I will tell you that the preface to the material is not like anything we've ever had to write before, because it has to acknowledge what you just said, which is that this is not a normal time for our country. And I will tell you unequivocally, yes, I think, speaking again in my personal capacity, without a doubt, Trump will be more dangerous for our country and for every American, including Arab Americans who might have a concern related to the Arab world. Without a doubt. We saw that when he was in office, and we will see more of it. And I worry about the country in general under a Trump administration. So what are people to do in these situations? I think that's a very, very difficult position. I happen to live in a state where it's not going to be close. So I'm being honest with you. Maybe that's not a big, dilemma for me, but for family members I talk to in Michigan, these are very, very difficult conversations. That's one point. The second point is, please don't stay home. Like the one thing that's exceedingly important for folks to understand is there's an importance of down ballot races across the board. So anywhere, if I would want you to vote in the presidential and vote your conscience, vote what you think is right, because, I mean, look, the other piece of the poll we didn't talk about is Arab Americans are awesome. Their civic engagement is really high. They participate on average, like 80% average in terms of voting, much higher than the average Americans' participation. This poll showed that only 63% of Arab Americans said they were enthusiastic about voting. And the number that killed me is the age of 18 to 29, 55% only. I understand it. I completely understand. It's the conversation we're having. How can my vote matter if everything I've done is still gotten us to this point? So I get it. It's just, I would point out, there are important Senate and House races. There are important gubernatorial races. There are important down ballot races, including on the local level. The stuff that's happening on the local level that's promoting bigotry and hatred is extraordinary, and we just really need to be there for that. But did I think that a year later we'd be where we are right now, under a Democratic administration? No. And I've been naive. I really am politically very naive. My kids would ask me, do we have to leave the country if Trump were elected? I'm like, Trump's not going to get elected. To this day, I don't believe Trump would win. So yeah, I'm a bit naive in that. I think it's partly how I have to be to do my work, but the engagement piece is absolutely critical, even though the decision is not a very good one. I will just simply say, though, this idea that there are no differences between the two parties is just deeply flawed. There are definitely differences, and we see that play out. And I, for one, am never gonna, as deeply as I care about this issue, and as the poll demonstrated, I will never turn on other vulnerable communities who are going to face some extraordinary, they're talking about mass deportations. I have a daughter. The issue of reproductive rights is extraordinarily important. When we asked Arab Americans in this last poll to rank their priority issues, not surprising, jobs in the economy, healthcare always come out. Gaza came out as number 2. Gun rights was the issue of gun violence, and reproductive rights was number 4. So we know that this community, like other Americans, are experiencing some pretty significant trauma with what's happening in our country. And then you add the piece of what we are having to see happen in terms of this uncontrolled violence, completely enabled by U.S. policies and weapons.
Maya, we don't know how to thank you enough, but thank you so much for coming on the show, and hopefully we'll have you back again, maybe after the election, or to discuss future plans too. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being with you.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you, Maya.
Thanks.
Guys, that was a rich and rewarding conversation with Maya about the status of Arab Americans historically, and in the run up to the coming election and so on. It was incredibly detailed, and I learned a lot about it. And then also it is, as most things that we talk about on this podcast have been, unfortunately, it was a bit depressing as well. But that's who we are. That's where we are right now. But what did you guys think of it? Kareem?
Soma, no, go ahead, Soma.
Well, I thought it was, Sadi, I agree with you. I think it was an extraordinarily illuminating discussion, especially the point that she made over and over again, beginning with a horrific testimony that, or Senate or whatever, that congressional hearing that she was subjected to, where she was
Senate hearing,
where she was ambushed by that horrific racist who said, "Put a bag on your head." I mean, things that are absolutely shocking. And what was so noticeable about that is, again, we've talked about this many times, and I know that, Edward Said, of course, wrote about this many times. But the whole point of the Arab exception, in the sense that the racism that's directed at Arabs and Muslims, but especially because of the question of Palestine, and directed at Arabs in particular because of the question of Palestine, and the way people have impunity in expressing the kinds of, and just sheer lack of filter when it comes to expressing that kind of racism, and seeing how much of anti-Muslim racism is also, specifically when you dig down, as you were saying, the Muslim ban itself was an Arab ban in a sense. It was all directed at Arab countries, right, with Iran, as well as Iran, but the vast majority of the countries were these Arab countries, and it was all about, sort of, always comes back to this question of Palestine at the heart of so much racism that's directed at Arabs and Muslims and others. That's what I was struck by in her, sort of, even though her point was to separate these out. Karim, what do you think?
No, I agree. And I think it was interesting when she talked about the Arab American community being a securitized community. I know some of you don't like that term, but I think it's a correct term.
I don't like that term.
Oh, you don't like it, but I mean, it is a securitized community in the sense of,
no, I know.
What she referred to, and the idea of, a lot of these people that she respects, lawyers and Congress people and the senators, all this kind of thing, who as she said, are know the Constitution inside out, talk about the First Amendment in all sorts of ways. But then when it comes to Arab Americans in particular, we move from discussions from civil rights to counterterrorism laws, or measures or decrees or whatever they are, which is what she was talking about, that you become, as an Arab American, we all do that. When we come to the airport, we all feel somehow that it's not so much that do we have civil rights here? It's like, they're going to look at me in a certain way, and I'm going to try to think, what did I do and what should I say, and prepare myself, because I'm going to get possibly at least harassed at the airport or any of these other kinds of places.
We've all been through that at various American airports.
The profiling and all this kind of thing. But I can only speak for myself, that I end up preparing myself for this thing, and I end up feeling as though I am securitized in that sense, and I need to be able to kind of prepare, make sure my phone doesn't have any like videos or whatever. So the shift that is particular to Arab Americans, it may be to others, but at least in our conversation about Arab Americans, where it shifts from civil rights to counterterrorism laws, when you're shifting away from talking, just sort of, things that bind such communities, cultural stuff, social stuff, which are, of course, these are important, of course, but a lot of it becomes purely politicized in the kind of high level of politics. And this includes now the question of the voting, and this discussion we had, which I find very interesting, about Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and some of these swing states in which Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, kind of more generally, are also kind of implicated and are being targeted. And we were talking about discussions that are taking place on social media, on TV, all over the place, in this kind of what I find this impossible position, which, especially in those states, I mean, you guys are in California, I'm outside of America now, etc. But in these swing states, where one has to move away from just being symbolic to say, well, the Democrats are genocidal, so I don't really care. Where the vote really doesn't, at least at the presidential level, doesn't really matter in California and places like this. But then you get to Ohio, you get to Pennsylvania, you get to Michigan, especially, you get to these places where the Arab American vote is decisive or potentially decisive. And you're confronted with, on the one hand, this incredibly genocidal regime, the Democratic Party, of which Kamala Harris is fully part of, and on the one hand, and with no compassion and not even a pretense of trying to reach out to these communities in any meaningful way.
Just no compassion.
Yeah,
actually,
she started.
I think it's actually.
Yeah, I mean, she started. Remember at the beginning when she took over, when it was very clear that young voters and Arab Americans were deeply opposed to Biden. She threw a few words here and there about Palestinian babies and things like that. But then a couple of weeks later, she switched and became pretty much like Biden. And
and at the convention, remember they took the total exclusion of Palestinian Americans.
The exclusion and the refusal.
Total exclusion.
So that on the one hand, on the other hand,
so they're telling us basically that's what their attitude is towards us. Basically.
So on the other hand, you've got this vicious man Trump and all of those around him who, who, as somebody
No,
you said,
it's
the
true. It's
Muslim,
true.
so much the Muslim ban as much as the Arab ban.
Well, it's a
And
Muslim
that's,
Arab ban, but it's also the
yeah, but
hearings in Congress came.
the
So the
hearings,
point
the
is that there's
senators, all that
the
whole
right
group
wing
of,
is terrifying in this
yeah,
country.
this group of
Yeah.
thugs, basically a
The
group of
the
racist.
crackdown on academic freedom will accelerate.
Academic freedom will be, they've already said, for sure they'll send in, they'll be much worse than the Democrats. But even basic things, as you say, I think it's important just to finish this, to remember that, of course, Arab Americans are also Americans, meaning they have to worry, as she's saying, about reproductive rights and women's rights and
Jobs and
healthcare
everything
and
else. Yeah.
jobs and all the rest of it. But on top of that, you have the particular hatred and poison that gets targeted to Arab Americans. And it's just incredibly sad to see that the Democrats on that level are just as are terrible. So you're faced with a terrible thing and a total maniac on the other hand. So I don't envy anybody in Michigan or Ohio and Pennsylvania who have to make these kinds of choices, frankly.
I would say the most important thing in a way, in terms of voting at least, and she made that point, is also down list, because what the president can or cannot do is determined or enabled by or stopped by what happens in Congress. So it's just as important or more important in some ways to vote for congressional or for Congress and Senate, House of Representatives and Senate than it is, and of course local things too, because a lot of the terrible racism takes place at a super local level in the U.S. As well.
But also, what she pointed out was very interesting is how not so much at the question of voting, but the question of how all these statistics that get up, first of all, that work their way up the system, they're all based on local reporting first and foremost, and then from there it goes all the way up. And for example, the stabbing or the shooting of the 3 Palestinian students in Vermont last year, which sent shockwaves, that hasn't been classified as a hate crime or is not being prosecuted as a hate crime thus far, which is which reminds us of how difficult it is, in the loopholes and how these things get reported. And Maya talked also about this business of the erasure of Arab American.
I was going to bring that up.
Reporting,
so important,
right? The erasure of Arab American reporting hate crimes against Arabs in America. After, she said it was after 2000. I don't remember when it was. There was a period, 15-year period.
It was gone
between
from
1997 to
2015 or something like that.
2015.
It was a long time.
So there's
well
a
after
complete
9/11.
During the Democrats, during Clinton's time, by the way.
During the Clinton time. So when people come back in history and to look into these statistics, then we realize, oh wait, hang on, these things are all missing from the archive. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means that they weren't reported.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of statistics, another thing that was really that struck me as somebody who's interested in the history of the history of Arabs in America. I think the whole question of whiteness and the emergence of this new Middle Eastern, North African category, which box to check, all that's fascinating. But the question of data collection is also, it's incredible. It's just
Are Israelis in that MENA category? If you're Israeli, do you click that MENA category?
Somebody I'm sure will let us know. I don't know.
Yeah. No, just one last point, just as part of our whole podcast series, which I think is important, is just to kind of connect all these things and say everything that we're confronting, from whether we're in Lebanon right now under Israeli invasion, to the genocide in Gaza, to the way in which Arab Americans are being, as you're saying, erased, or as Maya said, being erased as a community in terms of their hate crimes and all of this kind of thing, the way they get securitized, all of this is connected. And the bans on college campus that you guys are dealing with this business to and this is all over the world. I know it's happening in Europe and France and Britain and other places where if you so much as put up, I won't even mention Germany, but even in places like France, if you so much as put a watermelon, a kind of a poster with a watermelon, it's considered to be anti-Semitic or something like this. So this is a global thing. It's incredible how many fronts one has to fight at the same time. And
global Western thing,
global Western thing, meaning connecting all of these together.
Absolutely correct. And what's the key thread, Karim? The key thread is Palestine, right? It's on this question of Palestine, and then those associated with Palestine in one way or another.
Well, the key thing is not Palestine. The key thread is Zionism.
Yeah. Okay. Fair point.
Which is why, going back to one of our discussions last fall with my colleague Robin Kelly, when he said Palestine is ground zero for liberation, it's both historically and prospectively too. So, all right, thank you guys.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.